Welcome to The Culture. We rest at the pulse of the community, providing all things news, music, fashion, events, and everything that we talk about in between. It's a lifestyle. We are The Culture. Hi, and welcome to our show today. Joining us is NAACP South Dade Chapter President Dwight Bullard, Senator Dwight Bullard. Welcome to the show today.
Good to be here, Jessica. Happy to be here with you as always.
Yes, we appreciate you and all the insight that you're going to bring us. There are so many different things going on across the world. We're going to touch on a few today, but I want to start here a little local with Robert Runcie, Broward School Board Superintendent since 2011, was arrested for alleged perjury this week. Runcie's legal team issued a statement on Wednesday that he will plead not guilty and that they're not clear on what he is accused of lying about. Something doesn't seem right to me. What's your take on this?
Well, it smells and feels like an old-fashioned setup. And what I mean by that is this all stems from the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas back in 2018. After that shooting, the parents who have a lot of political influence and sway really, really wanted, someone to pay the price for the failure of systems to protect their children. And of course, that resulted in the removal of then Sheriff Scott Israel and him being replaced by Sheriff Greg Toney. But they didn't want to stop there. They had, particular notions about, who Robert Runcie is, what was his involvement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And especially because he was a firm believer that you cannot cast away a child, right? Like you just can't, condemn a 16 or 17-year-old who, has the propensity to make mistakes. And so he ran a lot of programs that, were there to help children. And one of the children that was part of that program was unfortunately the shooter at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. All that being said, Robert Runcie has done, as you pointed out, has been the head of the Broward County school system for the last 10 years. This is the sixth largest school district in the country. So for one group of people with political influence to basically go after Robert Runcie, for whatever they feel his role was in the unfortunate incident of February 14th, 2018, I think is foolish, foolhardy. I think it's irresponsible because you can't place the blame for what happened at the foot of the superintendent of schools as if he didn't do everything he was supposed to do. Was there school security there? Yes. Was there officers there? Yes. Did the school have a protocol or policy in place on active shooters prior to that? Yes. All those things were in place. So he did everything he could do. But nonetheless, this is now, there were 3 different investigations. He was cleared in all of the investigations, including the FBI investigation, including the state attorney investigation. But in this particular instance, the governor of the state of Florida created what is known as the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Commission, which, again, did its own investigation and again, cleared Robert Runcie of any wrongdoing. But now they're saying that during one of the proceedings that he supposedly said something or misrepresented himself or perjured himself during this thing. So just so folks understand, it's not like he perjured himself in a court of law or perjured himself, during a court proceeding. This was a committee created by the governor to do an investigation, cleared him of that investigation, but now they're saying that somehow he said something that resulted in perjury. So, if it quacks and has feathers, you got to call it a duck. And in this case, this is a set of circumstances that they should not be going after Robert Runcie for.
And so, because it was a committee appointed by the governor, what type of legal ramifications would the superintendent have to go down with this accusation of perjury?
Well, ultimately, he has to make the case that he did not perjure himself because, this was, a government funded commission that did, take sworn testimony. So, what his lawyer is going to basically do is say that and try to contradict the claim that he perjured himself. But you have to understand the politics of it is that the body that did the investigation was the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, which the governor has complete, purview over. So, the governor's office can say, hey, FDLE, I would like you to investigate X, and FDLE has to investigate X. So, it's one of those things where you really would hope that the governor would recuse himself and not take this so personally. But because, again, these particular parents have a particular influence and sway with this particular governor, it really does, smell inconsistent with the normal proceedings, normal legal proceedings that anyone else would operate under. It does feel very personal and very much a personal attack on Robert Runcie in particular, as opposed to something that, rises to the level of actual wrongdoing.
Dr. Rosalind Osgood, school board chair for Broward Schools, announced that they will discuss the indictment on this upcoming Tuesday and possibly vote on what to do. But then she issued this statement: we have no evidence, we have no information to make any decisions on because we don't know what the actual charges are other than perjury. Right.
And that's and this is the court of public opinion. And you really have to look at how this thing went down. In normal instances where you have public figures that have such, minor or, what feel like insignificant charges being placed upon them, they're issued, they're given an opportunity to surrender themselves or appear under their own, recognizance, and in this case, you're talking about going into this man's job, arresting him in front of all his staff, and then walking him out of the building. So the show, if you will, has now cast a negative light on who Robert Runcie is. So again, 10 years, no wrongdoing in anything else. Now you would think to have a tenure that long in any space that there would be something else, some sort of thing that you could point to and say, all right, well, here's a series of inconsistencies. But you're talking about somebody who, for lack of a better term, has kept his nose clean in this job and hasn't, done anything that rises to the, to the impact of, being handcuffed on his job and walked out of the building. And so, again, it just smells funny. And that's the thing that I think really has brought on the ire of organizations like the NAACP and others who are saying something is real problematic about this. Because even in the case of the former sheriff, he was, because he was constitutional officer, the governor could remove him from office, and they went through an investigation, but he never had to take a mug shot. He never had to go to, spend time in jail or be processed or any of this nonsense that's really going on right now. But in the case of Robert Runcie, here you have, them taking kind of full advantage of putting on this whole performative thing of, look what happened. We're handcuffing a black man, so what that means, and all the unnecessary innuendo that comes with that.
Yes. The whole defamation of character campaign.
Absolutely.
Now, for those residents within South Florida who would like to show some sort of support, who are looking for a call of action, who are standing and looking for a fair and due process, is there any message or call to action that you can alert them to?
Well, I would definitely encourage folks to, look into the case fully. Don't get caught up in the mugshot and the news story and all of the, again, performative measures that have been taking place. When you really, really look at this, nothing about this rises to the occasion of the treatment that Mr. Runcie has been receiving. And so I would definitely encourage folks to, if you feel a particular way, call an elected official, check in with your local NAACP. We're taking a strong position in support of, Superintendent Runcie in terms of just the process, not following suit. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, court cases and all the things. And my whole thing is that there's an interconnection. There is something to the idea of the criminality of Black people and how Black people are perceived by society. And so the fact that they're doing this really does fall in line with a historical trend line of Black men in power, or Black people in positions of power, being subject to a whole myriad of treatment that is vastly different than their white counterparts. And again, ask yourself that question. What has he done that is so wrong that, again, he's arrested, handcuffed, and walked out of a building in front of his staff? What does that rise to versus somebody who may have a bench warrant, somebody who may have, excessive, tickets that they may have collected that has produced a bench warrant. They're not going to come to your job to execute a bench warrant for swerving in the lane and that thing, and you not taking that to court. So you got to think about it in that frame. It wasn't a danger to society. It wasn't a threat to society. So the idea that you go through these kinds of steps means that you're trying to put forward and create a particular narrative that we have to push back on.
Yes. And as it relates to the trial verdict this week in the David Chauvin case, he was found guilty of all charges in the murder of George Floyd. It's bittersweet, right? Because you have many people who are thankful that justice served itself in this case, but then you have those who are conflicted over the fact that why are we even here?
Right. I'm one of those people in the latter, right? I mean, it is like you're happy that the family was able to seek justice, but when you think about, particular names that came out of last summer, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, Ahmaud Arbery, and of course George Floyd. When you think about it from that standpoint, if you just take those four cases, in two of the four cases, you have officers that did not even receive charges. So Breonna Taylor is dead, murdered by the bullets of a police gun, and no one was even, charged with, accidental manslaughter or anything along those lines. Remember, the charges that were brought against the one officer were for firing at the wall. So again, the wall got justice. Breonna Taylor did not. In the case of Jacob Blake, remember, we saw him shot in the back 7 times on video while his children were in the car. And somehow in that investigation, they concluded that somehow the officer was in danger. Now, Jessica, you have children, right? And you've gone to your car many times, right? I seriously doubt you would do anything to put your children in danger, especially while police are pursuing you. So if a police officer is 2 steps behind you, you're not going to your car to do anything crazy while your children sit in the back seat. So the idea that this man who's now suffering from paralysis from the waist down, will not be able to walk for the rest of his life. And we saw it all play out on television, just like we did George Floyd. Again, it's no semblance of justice it really does make the Floyd, the Chauvin verdict bittersweet, because you're just like, we can't, we can't win. It can never be upside down for us, meaning that we can't, the notion that we can expect justice in all four cases is somehow foreign to Black people. And that is the thing that bothers me the most, is that all this stuff is playing out on television. We're seeing the videos, we're seeing the body cam footage, we're seeing, folks filming these incidents, and yet and still not getting the same regard as, our white counterparts. While we're watching them, take, steal police cars, beat police with their own clubs. You had the one incident right after Dante Wright was killed in Minnesota. The police officer hanging on to a truck while the assailant basically drags him down the street. And again, was never shot, no guns drawn, walked into the jailhouse. So it's a question of the system, being fair. And we know that it's never been fair for us historically, but it really does frustrate you when all this stuff is happening in front of your very eyes. And you can't deny what you see. And so the idea that you can't find justice even in your own vision is so frustrating on so many levels.
Very frustrating. And I understand what's next for Chauvin is sentencing in 8 weeks. What does that look like?
So sentencing for him, if he were to get the maximum for all three charges, he would basically spend the rest of his natural life in prison. And I think folks would be quite content with that. But it's going to be one of those things where, something could also go sideways with that. Like they could make the sentences concurrent, right? So what that means is that, whatever the max sentence is for the highest felony, which would be the murder charge, all the other sentencing will be swept underneath that. So you basically have a scenario where he could do 10 to 15 years and still be up for parole. And again, that for a lot of folks, it's like, but he literally lynched the man on TV. And so that's one of the things we have to be very mindful of, is that, a system that has been, working and functioning in one particular way for so long is going to have a hard time correcting itself. And that's why, you're hearing the calls for reform and change and all these other things. This is what folks are talking about, is that, if you want a system to be even viewed as equitable or fair, then there has to be a uniformity across the board in how this thing works. And that, if anything, police officers should be held to a higher standard, meaning that if they do something like this, the charges should be equivalent, if not greater, to what we face in society. Like the mere fact that if we shot a gun at a police officer would get us 20 years in jail easy, let alone if we killed the police officer. That is life in prison, no parole for anybody who does that. Yet if when the shoe's on the other foot, now it's they were kind of doing their job. And it's like that's the frustrating part about this whole conversation. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. Minnesota's already moved to end what they call qualified immunity, which is that protection that police have under the law, that if they're acting in their job, that they somehow get some sort of blanket coverage. And other states will hopefully follow suit and end qualified immunity, so that we can see some accountability for these rogue officers.
And we noticed last year during the wake of George Floyd, his murder video being released, there were protests across the country.
Mm-hmm.
Protests. And then in September, Florida Governor DeSantis made a blanket statement that there should be legislation passed. Now I understand this anti-rioting legislation has is going through its legal process. Can you provide some clarity on where it is and what it means to many of the Floridians who may be even considering doing some sort of protest?
So yeah, I mean, HB1, as it was called, what the governor called an anti-riot bill, what the rest of us call an anti-First Amendment, anti-protest bill, has already passed, and he's already signed it into law. So now, and unlike most laws, which normally don't take effect till July 1, he made this effective immediately. And so it ends up coming out right before the Chauvin verdict, primarily because, I think there was a belief, especially by folks who have no desire to change the justice system from the way it's been, that he would have gotten off and that folks would have taken to the streets. So they basically wanted to put a law in place to undermine what would have likely been protest, but protests that were going to have a level of righteous anger. I mean, and that's the frustrating part for those of us in the activism space, is that no one wants to talk about the root cause. Everybody wants to talk about some sort of wayward solution, right? So you would think coming out of this past summer, there might be some legislation on, I don't know, trying to get police officers to stop killing Black people. Crazy concept, right? But just the idea of putting something in place that gives people the idea that the system is working for them. Instead, the priority bill for the governor was this HB1, which does not define riot and also does not really define protest. They say it does, but it basically says that a gathering of more than 3 people can ultimately result in those 3 people going to prison, for expanded charges. So what might have been, an obstruction of traffic ticket is now going to put you in jail at minimum for 24 hours because you're going to be held until the next day for a hearing, which means if, let's say, you do a protest on Friday, you're not going to see the light of day again for having stood on the corner with a sign until that Monday. And then again, all the fees that come with that, all the things that come with that. And it's excessive, it's problematic. It's really unconstitutional. And frankly, it's un-American for, a sitting United States governor to make this his first priority, because you would think that, a government's role is to protect its citizens or protect its people. And instead, he's more concerned about, what happens to the local, Walmart than he does about what happens to people's, civil rights.
Wow. I don't even understand how anything like this passed.
I mean, when you put enough political pressure on folks, and there's the thing about, this is the thing that makes politics, in my opinion, so subjective, right? Is that people will support bad legislation for something as simple as having their office on the right floor or having a good parking space, right? And this is the kind of like arbitrary threat that leadership will say is that, if you don't support this bill, we're going to move your office to the basement, or, or we're going to make you park, across the street as opposed to on property, just trivial things that folks say, oh, well, we can't have that happen. So let me support this completely unconstitutional legislation that, harms folks. And just so folks understand this, right before the bill was voted on, 120 different organizations around the state of Florida had spoken out in opposition of this. And when I say 120 organizations, I'm talking about NAACP, I'm talking about ACLU of Florida, I'm talking about Southern Poverty Law Center, I'm talking about all these like major and significant organizations talking about how flawed and messed up this bill is going to be and will ultimately cause harm for people. And you just saw folks that just didn't care. They just like, ah. And that, for me, is the greatest exercise in white privilege, is that when you know you're passing something that your sons or daughters won't be impacted by, but you know someone else's sons and daughters will be impacted by, but you still don't care, right? Is the idea that for me is when people sit there and say, well, what does white privilege look like? It looks like a mostly white state senate or state legislature voting on something that they know will harm Black and brown people and doing it anyway, right? And that is why we fight so hard. So when other folks sit there and say, well, why are you so upset? It's because this thing is going to directly impact Black and brown people, because we're the ones who are protesting, because we're the ones who've always had to protest the government to get the basic civil rights that we should have already had.
Right.
But that's been our main vehicle, whether it's a Dr. King or a Rosa Parks or, gay and lesbian community or, migrant community, Cesar Chavez, all these different folks. These are folks who literally had to use protest to get the basic level of protection, the basic level of rights. And so when you've never had to experience that, i.e., old white men, you get what you get.
So the ink is dry on this. However, is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Is there any way that this can be changed?
Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be ways that can be changed. I mean, ultimately, there are going to be a number of test cases that are going to challenge the validity of this legislation. The problem I have with that is that means someone has to get arrested and someone has to spend time in jail in order to prove this law to be unjust. And that, again, is a sacrifice that falls and a burden that falls on Black and brown people. So I don't know who it's going to be. I don't know where it's going to be. But I want you to think about that for your child who's in college or your friend and neighbor who just wants to make sure that they have, food on the table and a roof over their head. If they decide to take that to the streets to petition government for, again, basic human rights, and is perceived to be rioting in that space, that's going to be the thing that's going to test this law.
Well, thank you, Senator Bullard, for bringing so much insight to our viewers. I know that we greatly appreciate it. Thank you also for the call to action. And we look forward to seeing you all tonight right here on The Culture for another edition of My 2 Cents. Thanks again, Senator Bullard, for joining us, and we welcome you back at any time.
Thank you.
The Culture is produced and owned by Hip Rock Star Media and cannot be reproduced or broadcast without written consent by Jessica Garrett Modkins. All rights reserved.